Everyone remembers Johnny Carson as the most powerful man in late-night television. What they forget is that he built that power by fighting NBC 10 separate times and winning every single one. By 1974, NBC had settled into one of the most comfortable arrangements in the history of American broadcasting. Every Saturday and Sunday night, the network filled its prime airtime with reruns of The Tonight Show. No writers needed, no cameras rolling, no talent fees beyond what had already been paid. Just Johnny Carson's existing footage generated advertising revenue at essentially zero additional cost, while network executives congratulated themselves on their efficiency. Carson found the arrangement professionally insulting. He had spent more than a decade crafting an image of currency and freshness. The sense that tuning in to The Tonight Show meant tuning in to what was happening right now, tonight in American culture. Weekend reruns undermined that carefully built impression. The program's most valuable quality, the feeling that it was alive, happening in the present tense, was being quietly eroded every weekend for the sake of NBC's convenience. He petitioned the network to end the practice. NBC refused. The math was simply too favorable. Why surrender 90 minutes of cost-free programming because a performer had aesthetic objections? Carson issued an ultimatum: end the weekend reruns, or he would exercise his contractual right to leave the network entirely. Each time NBC faced his ultimatums, the network arrived at the same reluctant conclusion. There was no Tonight Show without Johnny Carson, and there was no replacing him. They agreed to his demand, and then they faced the problem they had refused to think about until this moment. 90 minutes of Saturday night programming, empty, with no plan, and no program ready to fill it. Network executives approached a young producer named Lorne Michaels with a commission that was, by the standards of network television, almost laughably open-ended. Develop something original, make it live, fill the time. In October of 1975, Saturday Night Live made its debut on NBC. What followed is genuinely difficult to overstate. The program, born directly from Carson's vacation grievance, became one of the most enduring creative institutions in the history of American television. It launched careers that defined comedy for generations, shaped political satire, introduced the country to performers who became household names, and is still producing original live television more than 50 years after its first broadcast. None of it would exist if Johnny Carson had simply accepted the reruns. NBC's executives had experienced his demand as an inconvenient labor dispute, a talent being difficult about scheduling. They could not have imagined, as they scrambled to fill 90 minutes of empty airtime, that their solution to Carson's vacation problem would outlast virtually everything else the network ever produced. Carson himself was characteristically understated about the connection. He had not set out to create a television institution. He had set out to protect the freshness of his own program. That the two things happened to be linked was simply the kind of outcome that followed when you refused to accept arrangements that weren't right. It was a lesson he had learned years earlier, in the very first real fight he ever picked with NBC, nearly a decade before Lorne Michaels received his commission. The year was 1967, and the American Federation of Television and Radio Artists had called a strike. The question was the same for every performer in American broadcasting: honor the picket line or cross it. Carson, by this point the undisputed anchor of NBC's late-night schedule, chose to honor it without hesitation. NBC's response revealed a great deal about how the network understood the relationship between an institution and the talent that made it profitable. With Carson refusing to perform, the network began airing reruns of The Tonight Show without his permission and without negotiating any fee for the use of his work, treating the program it had built around one man as raw material it could deploy however it wished, regardless of his wishes or consent. Carson did not issue a quiet complaint through representatives. He quit. On the 4th of April, 1967, he walked off The Tonight Show and publicly accused NBC of treating its most profitable late-night franchise like, in his own words, a red-headed stepchild running on a shoestring budget. The characterization was pointed and deliberately humiliating for a network that prided itself on the prestige of its flagship programming. NBC threatened to hold Carson to his existing contract through 1970, meaning he could not work for any competing broadcaster for 3 additional years. It was designed to make walking away feel financially catastrophic and professionally terminal. Carson did not blink. The standoff lasted 3 weeks. At the end of those 3 weeks, it was NBC that moved. Carson's weekly salary rose from $7,500 to $20,000, an increase of more than 160%. He also secured meaningful new creative control over the show's production. The network that had threatened him with lawyers ended the confrontation by writing him a dramatically larger check, and notably made no counteroffer in the days before capitulating. When the institution finally moved, it moved all the way. What made this victory significant was not merely the financial result. It was what the outcome revealed about the nature of Carson's leverage. He was the irreplaceable center of a program that the network could not replicate, could not substitute, and could not afford to lose. He understood this with complete precision. NBC was slower to accept it. He would spend the next 25 years making sure they never forgot. And the toll of that vigilance, the permanent alertness required to remain always one step ahead of an institution that would happily have consumed him, was something he carried quietly, visible only to those who knew him well enough to notice when the professional ease masked genuine exhaustion. That confrontation had been loud, public, and resolved in a matter of weeks. What came next asked something entirely different of him. Not courage in the sudden, declarative sense, but patience. The kind that asks you to absorb an indignity in silence, night after night, and trust that the institution will eventually be the one to move. Somewhere in Chicago, on a Tuesday evening in 1965, a woman turned on her television at 11:20 and found Ed McMahon talking to a band leader she barely recognized. She waited and waited. Johnny Carson did not appear for 15 minutes. She had no idea that this was intentional, that the host she was waiting for was standing 30 feet off stage, entirely ready, refusing on principle to walk out until she could see him from the very beginning. When Carson inherited The Tonight Show in 1962, the program began at 11:15 in the evening, a scheduling holdover from the Jack Paar era that no one had thought to question simply because it had always been that way. Many NBC affiliates chose to broadcast local news until 11:30, meaning a significant portion of the national audience routinely missed the first 15 minutes every single night. They missed the monologue. They missed Carson's opening, the creative centerpiece of the entire program. Carson raised the issue with NBC. The network declined to act with any urgency. Between 1965 and 1966, he responded in the only language the institution seemed to understand consistently. He stopped appearing on stage until 11:30. Night after night, Ed McMahon and bandleader Skitch Henderson hosted the opening quarter hour without him. Carson waited in the wings, entirely prepared, and simply did not walk out until the time he believed was right. There were no press releases, no public statements, no dramatic walkouts. Just a sustained, patient, quietly maddening act of professional self-determination that continued for the better part of 2 years. In January of 1967, NBC eliminated the 11:15 segment entirely. The 11:30 start time became the permanent, industry-wide standard for late-night television. It remains so today. Every monologue, every desk interview, every musical performance across all the decades since has begun at 11:30 because Johnny Carson once refused, quietly and persistently, to walk onto a stage 15 minutes earlier. What Carson never said publicly, and what those who knew him well understood, was that 2 years of staged absence had been in its own way professionally wearing. Winning a battle no one knew was being fought meant celebrating a victory no one would ever acknowledge. The men and women who turned on their televisions at 11:30 on the night NBC made that change had no idea what they were receiving. They simply found Johnny Carson waiting for them, as he always had, and settled in for the evening entirely unaware that someone had spent 2 years making sure they could. That invisibility was the purest expression of how Carson operated. He was not interested in credit for the battles he won. He was interested in winning them. If you're enjoying this journey through the side of Johnny Carson that most Americans never saw, make sure you subscribe and click the bell. Carson spent 2 years making sure you could watch him from the very start of his program. This is a considerably smaller task. And what is still ahead includes the night a portable toilet company in Michigan discovered that taking liberties with his identity carried consequences they had never anticipated, and the story of his final television appearance. which made permanently clear that 30 years of network television had never, not for a single day, changed who he fundamentally was. Throughout his 3 decades as host, Carson maintained a public position on politics that was, by the standards of his era, remarkably disciplined. He hosted guests from across the full range of American political opinion, kept his personal views consistently private, and stated repeatedly that The Tonight Show was not the appropriate venue for partisan advocacy. That mixing entertainment with political persuasion was a disservice to an audience that came to him for something else entirely. His position was not performance. It was a genuine professional philosophy rooted in his understanding of the people watching at home, a broad, politically varied group of Americans who deserved better than to be told what to think by a man they had invited into their living rooms, which makes what happened during the Watergate period of 1972 to 1974 all the more remarkable. As the scandal surrounding President Richard Nixon's administration unfolded, Carson's monologue began to change in texture, not dramatically, not in any way that announced itself as political commentary. The changes were subtle: a joke about convenient memory lapses, a wry reference to accidental erasures on recording tape, an observation about the general reliability of official accounts. Carson never named his targets directly; he never needed to. Those who watched during those years later described a particular quality to those moments: a pause after the punchline that lasted slightly longer than usual, a look toward the audience that invited them to share something that did not need to be named aloud. The studio would go quiet in a way that was different from ordinary laughter. Then the applause would come, louder than the joke seemed to warrant, the quiet electricity of a room full of people who all know exactly what is being said without it being said directly. The jokes were framed, always, as entertainment. Carson maintained perfect deniability. He was simply a comedian observing the news cycle, as comedians had always done. What researchers analyzing this period later documented suggested the reality was far more consequential. Statistical analysis of Carson's Watergate-era monologues revealed a measurable correlation between his critical mentions of the Nixon administration and a 1.4 drop in the president's approval rating. For each such reference on the program, consider what that figure represents. A man who publicly insisted he had no political agenda was, through the careful use of comedy, moving the needle on presidential approval ratings in a country of more than 200 million people. His restraint had made his voice, on the rare occasions he chose to use it this way, extraordinarily powerful. A man who raises his voice every day would have been tuned out. Carson raised him almost never. When he did, the country listened in a way it listened to almost no one else. He was not a journalist. He was not an activist. He was a comedian who told jokes about his golf game and interviewed movie stars. And yet he was influencing public opinion on the most momentous political crisis of the decade, one carefully timed joke at a time. He never claimed the influence. He simply continued to watch and occasionally, with exquisite timing, to remark. And he carried the weight of that restraint privately, the discipline of someone who understood exactly how much damage he could do and chose almost always not to. Some of Carson's victories over the establishment were matters of high principle. Some were matters of financial necessity. And then there was the matter of the portable toilets. A Michigan-based company had begun selling portable restroom units under the marketing name Here's Johnny, explicitly invoking Ed McMahon's legendary nightly introduction, 3 words that had opened The Tonight Show for years and become among the most recognized phrases in American broadcasting. The company marketed their product as the world's foremost commodian. The wordplay was entirely deliberate. The commercial exploitation of Carson's identity was, to any reasonable observer, completely undeniable. Carson sued, citing unfair competition and invasion of his right of publicity. American law at the time defined a celebrity's protected identity with striking narrowness. Only a person's literal name or physical likeness was considered protected commercial property. A company that had used neither Carson's name nor his photograph had, by the prevailing legal logic, done nothing actionable. A lower district court dismissed Carson's claim on precisely these grounds. Carson appealed. In 1983, the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled in his favor, determining that a celebrity's identity could be commercially exploited without using their exact name or photograph, and that such exploitation was still fully actionable under the law, The ruling extended protections to include catchphrases and other elements closely associated with a performer's public identity. The portable toilet company had, in pursuing their pun, accidentally provided the occasion for one of the most significant expansions of performer legal rights in American history. Entertainers who came after Carson would find legal protections waiting for them that had not existed before a Michigan company decided that "Here's Johnny" was a charming name for a portable restroom. Carson had gone to court over what many in the industry regarded as wounded pride. He had come away with a legal precedent that reshaped the rights of every public performer in the country. He had also, it should be noted, won. We are exactly at the midpoint of Carson's 10 greatest battles, and we genuinely want to know, which of these stories has surprised you most so far? Leave us a comment below. We read every one of them, and while you're there, tell us which Golden Age Hollywood story you would like to see us cover next. Your suggestions shape every video we make. NBC had held its ground in New York for decades because no one had ever given it a compelling reason to move. Carson was about to change that, and the question was not whether the network would resist, but how long that resistance could hold against someone who had already proven twice that he was entirely willing to wait them out. The Tonight Show was a New York program produced at Rockefeller Center, surrounded by the cultural infrastructure of Broadway, the publishing world, and the East Coast press. For network executives, this was simply the natural order of broadcasting, as settled and obvious as any other fact of professional life. Carson observed something the institution had been slower to acknowledge. The major film stars were increasingly reluctant to travel from California to New York for brief television appearances. The talent was in California, the audience was wherever the talent was. The only question was how long NBC intended to pretend otherwise. On the 1st of May, 1972, The Tonight Show broadcast from New York for the last time. Carson permanently relocated the program to NBC Studios in Burbank, California. The network was compelled to invest substantially in its West Coast infrastructure to accommodate a flagship program now operating 3,000 miles from where it had always been. An establishment that had defined American broadcasting for an entire generation found itself no longer at the center of the conversation it had built, not through a corporate strategy or an industry-wide trend, but because one host had read the future correctly and moved toward it before the institution was prepared to follow. Guests who had previously declined the cross-country journey now found the program conveniently close. The creative community that had been reluctant to engage with a New York-based production found itself living minutes from where Carson taped every evening. The program became, by geography as much as by quality, the natural home of the industry's most interesting conversations. Network executives experienced the relocation as a logistical concession to a demanding talent. History experienced it as something far more significant, the moment when the center of American broadcasting formally acknowledged where the creative industry had already moved. Carson had been right. The institution had been late. The combination, by this point in his career, was entirely familiar. What was less visible was what the move had required of Carson personally. Uprooting a major television production, its crew, its rhythms, its institutional memory, and transplanting it to a coast where the network's infrastructure barely existed was not a clean or frictionless undertaking. Those who worked through the transition later described a period of genuine organizational strain. Carson absorbed that without public complaint because the outcome he was working toward was worth it. But it cost something to get there. It always did. And what came next would cost him something too, though the currency would be entirely different. There is a moment in the history of every institution when it becomes possible to see clearly what it is actually afraid of. For the corporate advertising world of mid-century American television, that fear was simple and absolute. Sponsors were sacred. Failure was not an option. The notion of a host turning a sponsor's investment into a comedy sketch was not merely discouraged. It was, in the unwritten laws governing the medium, essentially unthinkable. In September of 1973, a dog named Hernandez quietly brought that assumption to an end. Carson was performing a live commercial for Alpo dog food. Hernandez, whose role was straightforward, consumed the product on camera with visible enthusiasm, had evidently not been fully briefed on the professional expectations involved. He declined to eat. Every professional television host of the era would have compensated. Project more enthusiasm. Redirect with energy. protect the sponsor's investment at whatever personal cost to one's own dignity. Carson looked at Hernandez, he looked at the camera. He chose the other direction. Rather than rescuing the commercial, he leaned into its failure, treating Hernandez's comprehensive indifference as the funniest thing that had happened on the program in recent memory, and transforming the advertisement into an improvised comedy sketch that gave the audience something far more entertaining than a successful dog food endorsement would ever have been. Because Carson was generating approximately 17% of NBC's total pre-tax profits by the mid-1970s, neither the sponsor nor the network executives possessed meaningful leverage with which to respond. His economic indispensability had quietly and completely freed him from the obligations that constrained every other host in America. He was not merely indispensable, he was, in the precise financial sense of the word, untouchable. Every advertiser who watched that evening understood it. Every network executive who reviewed the tape understood it. And Carson, who had understood it for years before anyone else was willing to say so aloud, simply smiled, scratched the dog behind the ears, and moved on to the next segment. The contract Carson negotiated in 1980 does not receive the attention it deserves in the popular memory of his career. The monologue, the celebrity interviews, the discovery of so many young comedians, these are what endure in the public imagination. The contractual revolution he engineered in a single negotiation tends to receive far less notice, which is precisely as Carson would have preferred it. By the late 1970s, Carson's frustration with the terms of his NBC agreement had reached a threshold he was no longer willing to maintain. In 1979, he announced his intention to leave the program the following year, citing a California law that prohibited personal service contracts from exceeding 7 years. The legal basis for his position was sound. His intention to act on it was entirely genuine. NBC's response arrived quickly and at full volume. The network threatened a lawsuit valued at $100 million, asserting that Carson was contractually bound through 1981 regardless of California law. A 9-figure legal liability designed to make walking away feel financially catastrophic. The dispute attracted attention well beyond NBC's offices. ABC and CBS both approached Carson with offers of double his existing salary, actions that were later found to have been improper. NBC, alarmed, hired an arbitration firm confident. A formal review would restore the protections the network believed it was owed. The arbitrators examined the California law Carson had cited. They examined NBC's exclusivity clauses. And then they ruled, not in NBC's favor, not as a negotiated compromise, but completely and unambiguously for Carson. He was free. What followed was a negotiation unlike anything the television industry had previously produced. Carson's new agreement established an annual salary of $25 million, reduced his hosting obligations to 3 evenings per week, shortened the program from 90 minutes to 60 minutes, and included a provision that, more than any other element, reflected the true scope of what he had achieved. Full ownership of The Tonight Show and its entire archive of broadcasts through Carson Productions. He had arrived at NBC as an employee, performing on a stage the network owned, on a program the network controlled. He left the negotiating table in 1980 as the owner of the program itself. Every evening that had already aired, every evening still to come, hi. The audience watching him that night and every night that followed saw no difference in the man behind the desk. What they could not see was that the relationship between that man and the institution had been fundamentally and permanently transformed. He had never belonged to NBC. Now it was written down. And if those who knew him well noticed that winning this particular battle seemed to settle something in him that the earlier ones had not, a quieter quality behind the professional composure, something closer to peace, they understood why. This one had cost the most to get to, and it had given back the most in return. One evening in 1988, a man walked onto The Tonight Show's stage and behaved as though he owned it. He turned to the studio audience without invitation. He interrupted the host mid-sentence. He filled the room with an energy that was not entertainment so much as provocation, the deliberate manufacture of the sensation that something was about to go wrong, that the civility holding the conversation together was fragile and might not hold. Morton Downey Jr. had spent years perfecting exactly this quality of menace, building a broadcasting career on the principle that aggression was more watchable than intelligence, that manufactured confrontation sold better than genuine conversation. When he appeared on The Tonight Show in 1988, he brought that entire philosophy through the door with him. The collision was not between two personalities, it was between two completely opposing visions of what television was for. Carson ended the interview before its scheduled conclusion. Those present noted that he was visibly displeased in a way his customary composure rarely permitted to show. Privately, he described the appearance as a circus act. Downey was removed from future booking consideration without public announcement or explanation. The same quiet exclusion was applied to Howard Stern, who had publicly mocked Carson's approach to his craft, characterizing his measured style as a relic of an earlier and less interesting era. No statement was issued, no public confrontation occurred. The door simply closed and remained closed. Where Stern had expected a reaction, he received silence. In Carson's world, silence was the most definitive response available. What Carson was protecting was not merely his program's tone, it was a standard of what late-night television could be. A space where genuine intelligence and authentic connection between a host and a guest could produce something worth watching. He had built that standard over 30 years and was not prepared to surrender it because the rest of the industry had discovered that conflict was profitable. Viewers at home never knew which guests had been quietly turned away or why. They simply continued to experience a program that maintained its character with remarkable consistency, never knowing that consistency had been actively, deliberately defended, and that defending it had required Carson a vigilance that never fully rested. The final chapter in Carson's relationship with institutional power does not involve a network contract or a legal precedent or a scheduling dispute. It involves something far more personal, loyalty, and what happens when the people who owe it most are the ones who withhold it. Joan Rivers had been Carson's protege in the most complete sense of that word. He had championed her career at a time when female comedians occupied a genuinely marginal position in American entertainment, given her the role of permanent guest host on The Tonight Show, the most prominent recurring platform available to any comedian in the country, and treated her by every account with genuine warmth and consistent advocacy across many years. In 1986, Rivers accepted an offer to host a competing late-night program on the new Fox network. The announcement reached the press before it reached Carson. The precise sequence of what followed remains genuinely disputed, and both versions deserve to be heard. Rivers maintained that she had attempted to inform Carson personally before the news became public, and that he refused to take her call. Carson maintained that she had not told him before the story broke. What no one disputes is the consequence. Carson banned Rivers from The Tonight Show. The ban was total, immediate, and without public explanation. It lasted until Jimmy Fallon assumed the hosting duties in 2014, 2 decades after Carson's retirement, and 9 years after Carson himself had passed away in January of 2005. The wound never fully closed. He had extended an unusual degree of personal investment in Rivers' career and experienced her departure as a betrayal that went beyond the merely professional. He simply withdrew, as he always withdrew from things he had decided were finished, with absolute and final completeness. When NBC's executives subsequently chose Jay Leno to succeed Carson, passing over David Letterman, whom Carson had privately identified as his preferred choice. Carson's response was characteristically unhurried and characteristically definitive. He would make his position clear when the moment was right, on terms entirely his own. During the final weeks of his tenure, Letterman was invited to appear on The Tonight Show and pay tribute to the program and its host. The appearance was warm, genuine, and publicly visible. Leno, NBC's chosen man, the network's decision about the franchise Carson had built, was notably absent from those farewell celebrations. And then, in 1994, Carson made his final television appearance. It was not on NBC, it was not on The Tonight Show, or any program associated with the network that had employed him for 30 years. It was a brief, unannounced cameo on David Letterman's program on CBS. A single understated gesture that required no explanation and admitted no ambiguity. Carson had appeared where he wished to appear, for the person he wished to honor, on a network that NBC would have preferred he avoid because those were his terms. and they had always been his terms. Of all the things Johnny Carson did across 30 years of television, the monologues, the interviews, the fights won in offices no camera ever entered, this single cameo on someone else's program may have said more about him than any of it. Not because of what he did, because of where he chose to do it, and for whom. The man who had walked off NBC in 1967 rather than accept a contract he found insulting had, nearly 3 decades later, made his final appearance on his own schedule, in his own manner, on his own terms. The institution had never broken him, it had never fully contained him. And in the end, it could not even claim his farewell. He was 68 years old. He had been doing this since before most of the people watching television that evening had been born. And in that final gesture, quiet, wordless, and aimed with perfect precision at exactly the right person, he said everything that needed to be said about what 30 years had meant and to whom he had ultimately belonged. 30 years of American evenings were shaped by a man who made institutional resistance look like effortless charm. The 11:30 start time that audiences take for granted today, Carson fought for that. The West Coast creative community that gave American entertainment its modern character. Carson moved toward that when the establishment was still facing the other direction. The legal protections that performers rely on when their identities are exploited, Carson established those in a federal appeals court over a portable toilet. The Saturday night tradition that 3 generations of Americans grew up with, Carson's vacation schedule made that possible, almost by accident, in a moment NBC experienced as nothing more than a minor scheduling inconvenience. He won every major fight he chose to engage, not through aggression or public campaigns or dramatic gestures, but through the quiet application of extraordinary leverage in the hands of someone who understood precisely what he was worth and refused, consistently and without apology, to accept anything less. The audience who watched him never needed to know any of this. That was part of the grace of it. The battles were his to fight, and the results were theirs to enjoy, and the distance between those two things was maintained without complaint across 3 decades. What the camera showed America every night was a man entirely at ease. What the camera never showed was the discipline that produced that ease. The contracts negotiated, the standards enforced, the institutions pressed back into their proper positions by a host who never once forgot that the program existed for the people watching at home and not for the network counting the revenue. If Carson's story has given you a new appreciation for the man behind the monologue, for the battles fought in boardrooms and courtrooms and green rooms that most of his audience never knew were happening, please give this video a like. It genuinely helps more classic Hollywood fans find their way to us, and share it with someone in your life who grew up watching him. Some stories deserve a wider audience than they have been given. Johnny Carson did not simply entertain America for 30 years. He quietly, persistently, and entirely on his own terms decided what that entertainment would look like. And the world he shaped is still visible every time the lights go down and the band strikes up at 11:30. Thank you for watching.